I want to show you something in the Noah story that I read past for about 20 years without noticing. Count the days Genesis actually gives you. 7 days of waiting, another 7, then 40, then 150. Then the counting turns around and comes back. 150, 40, 7, 7. The numbers climb, and then they descend in the same order they climbed. And right at the turn, at the top, there's one line sitting by itself. And God remembered Noah. But this isn't only Noah. Start with the basic idea, because everything else sits on top of it. Ancient Hebrew writers often didn't build a story the way we do. We build toward the end. The last chapter is where the meaning lives, which is how novels work, how films work, and honestly, how most sermons work. A lot of Hebrew writing builds toward the middle. Picture walking a trail up a hill and back down the same way. On the climb, you pass a spring and a fallen gate. Coming down, you pass the gate, then the spring. Whatever you found at the top is the reason you went. The rest was walking. Scholars call this a chiasm, after the Greek letter chi, which is shaped like an X. Gordon Wenham preferred the word polystrophy, meaning something that turns back on itself, and I think that's the clearer word. Once you know to look, you start finding it in passages you've had memorized since childhood. Psalm 23 opens with sheep and pasture and quiet water. It closes with a table, a cup, an anointed head, a house, shepherd on one side, host on the other. And right where those two halves meet, the psalmist stops describing God and starts speaking to him, "For you are with me." That's the top of the hill. Nearly every English language sermon I've heard on Psalm 23 lands on dwelling in the house of the Lord forever, because we're trained to look at endings, and the ending is beautiful. But the Hebrew shape of the poem is pointing at a different line. Jonah works similarly. 4 chapters, and the emotional center isn't the fish or Nineveh repenting. It's a prayer from inside a sea creature, which is the only place in the whole book where Jonah stops running long enough to talk to God. So that's the small version. A Hebrew writer wanting to underline something often didn't write it louder. He built the room around it. What happens when you zoom out is stranger. It isn't only short poems. Whole books were put together this way, and in a couple of cases, whole collections of books. Back to the flood. Wenham published his analysis in 1978 in the journal Vetus Testamentum, and it's now in most serious Genesis commentaries. Violence on the earth, a speech from God, entry into the ark. The waters rise, then the waters fall. They leave the ark, God speaks again, and he promises never to do this again. Roughly a dozen matched pairs and planted in the middle. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. Wenham made an observation about this that stuck with me. The shape of the text copies the shape of the event. The water rises, and the story rises with it. The water drains, and the story drains. You end up inside the flood rather than beside it. And the moment the water turns is the moment the text turns. God remembering is what makes it stop. Now widen it again. The Torah has 5 books. Genesis and Deuteronomy sit on the outside, both loaded with covenant and blessing. Exodus and Numbers sit inside those, both wilderness books full of complaint and plague and walking. Alone in the middle is Leviticus, which is the book everybody's Bible in a year plan dies in. Go to the center of Leviticus and you land in chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. The one day of the year, the high priest goes past the veil carrying blood. The middle of the Torah is the day sin gets dealt with. It goes further, and this is where Mary Douglas comes in. She was an anthropologist, not a theologian, and in 1999, Oxford published her book Leviticus as literature. Her argument is that Leviticus isn't just a book about the tabernacle. Leviticus is built in the shape of the tabernacle, 3 sections matching the 3 zones of the sanctuary and matching them proportionally. The big opening block lines up with the outer court. A middle block lines up with the holy place. A short final block lines up with the Holy of Holies. Leviticus contains only 2 narrative passages in the entire book, and Douglas noticed they fall exactly where the 2 curtains hang. Read it front to back and you're walking into the tent. Not everyone buys her reading, for the record. Some scholars think she's forcing it, and there's a competing proposal that Leviticus rings around chapter 19 instead. I lean toward Douglas, but I hold it loosely. Exodus was already doing something like this. Peter Kearney pointed out in 1977 that the tabernacle instructions in Exodus, chapter 25 through 31, break into exactly 7 speeches, each one opening with the same formula. And the Lord spoke to Moses. 7 of them. The 7th has nothing to do with furniture. It's the command to keep the Sabbath. 7 speeches ending in Sabbath. Genesis chapter 1 runs on the same engine, and the numbers under the English are tighter than most of us realize. Umberto Cassuto sat down and counted them. The Hebrew word for God appears 35 times, which is 7 times 5. The word for earth appears 21 times. So does the word for heavens. The phrase, "and it was good," appears 7 times. The first verse is 7 Hebrew words. The second verse is 14. The creation week isn't only about 7 days. It's assembled out of 7s. So when Israel builds a tent for the God who made the world in 7, they build it using 7 speeches. That's the kind of thing you can only do on purpose. The question I kept circling back to while researching this was why? What's the point of hiding your emphasis in the floor plan instead of just saying it? The practical answer first. Almost nobody in ancient Israel owned a scroll. Scrolls were expensive and rare and lived in sanctuaries. Scripture reached ordinary people through their ears, read out loud in gatherings, repeated, memorized. Symmetry is how you make something hold in memory. When the back half of a passage mirrors the front half, a listener who drifts can find their place again. Douglas argued that ancient audiences had a trained ear for this that modern silent readers have basically lost. And I think she's right. We read fast, alone, with our eyes. They listened slowly in a group, with their whole memory. Which means we aren't reading these texts wrong so much as reading them with the wrong equipment. The theological answer matters more. When an author puts something in the center, he's preaching without saying a word about it. He never has to write, and this part is the important one. He builds it into the plan and trusts you to find it. That reframes the parts of the Bible we skip. Take the genealogy at the front of Matthew. 42 names, and Matthew stops at the end to point out the count himself. 14 from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile, 14 from the exile to Christ. Why 14? In Hebrew, letters double as numbers, and David's name is 3 consonants. Dalet, Vav, Dalet. 4, 6, 4. Matthew says the word David 3 times using nothing but the length of a list, and he had to compress the record to get there, skipping kings that appear in Chronicles and counting one name twice. He knew the king list. He was making an argument in arithmetic. Mark does his own version, which commentators call intercalation, or more often, just the Markan sandwich. He starts a story, cuts away to a completely different one, then comes back and finishes the first. Jairus is begging for his dying daughter when a bleeding woman interrupts the whole journey. Jesus curses a fig tree with no fruit on it, walks into the temple and starts flipping tables, then walks back out past a tree that's now dead to the roots. Mark never connects the two out loud. He doesn't need to. John built his gospel on 7 signs and 7 I am statements. Revelation runs on 7s so relentlessly that at some point the 7s are the plot. These men were preaching with proportion, and we've been reading it as filler. Here's the part that made me want to make this video, and I sat with it for about a week before I felt like I understood it. If a writer can use structure to say something, he can also use broken structure to say something. And there's one book where the architecture visibly falls apart while you're reading it. Lamentations, 5 poems about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and chapters 1, 2, and 4 are alphabetic acrostics. First verse starts with Aleph, second with Beth, straight down to the last letter. You can feel what he's doing. He's putting grief in alphabetical order because that's the only order left. Chapter 3, right in the middle, doesn't just keep the pattern, it triples it. 66 verses, 3 per letter, the most tightly built chapter in the book. And what's inside that structure is the one break in the clouds anywhere in Lamentations. His mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now watch the frame start to thin. Chapters 1 and 2 give 3 poetic lines per letter. Chapter 4 drops to 2. The scaffolding is coming down. Then you get to chapter 5, 22 verses. Exactly 22, 1 for every letter, so the outline of the acrostic is still hanging there like an empty frame. But there's no acrostic. Not one letter is where it should be. He still counts to 22 because he knows what he's supposed to be doing. He just can't do it anymore. A commentator I read put it better than I can. The book moves from there are no words to there are no letters, and the book ends on a question nobody answers. Unless you have utterly rejected us, that's in the Bible. God let a poem into the canon that grieves hard enough to lose the ability to hold its own shape. If you've ever prayed badly in pieces, without the strength to finish the sentence, there's a book built in exactly that condition. I have to put a fence around all of this because this subject attracts a lot of nonsense, and the nonsense makes the real thing harder to defend. There's an entire industry of biblical numerology. Ivan Panin claimed thousands of hidden multiples of 7 across the Hebrew and Greek. Bible codebooks find prophecies by pulling out every 49th letter. Some of it is sincerely meant. Very little of it survives contact with a scholar. So how do you sort the architecture from the imagination? What I use is 3 questions. First, does the writer flag it himself? Matthew tells you there are 3 sets of 14. Genesis names the 7 days out loud. Lamentations counts to 22 in front of you. Biblical structure usually sits in plain sight. We just stopped being able to hear it. Second, does the pattern survive in Hebrew or Greek? Casuto's counts are counts of Hebrew words. A pattern that only shows up in the King James wording tells you something about 17th century translators. Third, does it depend on chapter numbers? And this one takes out a lot of popular claims. You've probably heard that Isaiah is a miniature Bible. 66 chapters for 66 books. 39 chapters in the front section for 39 Old Testament books. 27 in the back for 27 New Testament books. It's a lovely observation, and it means nothing. Chapter divisions were worked out around 1205 by Stephen Langton, a theologian at the University of Paris, who later became Archbishop of Canterbury. Isaiah went about 1900 years without chapters. The Protestant canon wasn't even settled at 66 books when Langton was numbering. The pattern is real. Its author is a medieval Englishman. Same caution on the claim that Israel's camp in Numbers chapter 2 makes a cross when you graph the census. The text describes 4 divisions around the tabernacle and gives the numbers. Judah east at 186,400. Reuben south at 151,450. Ephraim west at 108,100. Dan north at 157,600. Whether we're meant to plot those to scale and look at the outline is a modern idea, not something the passage asks for. What the text does say is simpler and stronger. God's dwelling sat at the exact center of the nation, and every tent faced it. You don't need to add extras. Which brings me to the largest structure of all, and the one I find hardest to shake. There's exactly one shape in Scripture that shows up only where God is. A cube. The Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple measures 20 cubits long, 20 wide, 20 high. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 20. One man goes in one day a year carrying blood. Hold that and turn to the last 2 chapters of the Bible. John watches an angel measure the New Jerusalem. 12,000 stadia long, 12,000 wide, 12,000 high. The city is a cube, roughly 1,400 miles on a side. The room one priest could enter has become a city that everybody lives inside, and John mentions, almost in passing, that he saw no temple in it. There's no temple because there's nothing there that isn't temple. Then look at the outer frame. The Bible opens in a garden with a river running through it, and the tree of life beside the water. It closes with a river running through a city, and the tree of life on both banks. Same 2 objects, first page and last. And if the pattern holds the way it's held everywhere else we've looked today, then the weight of the book sits somewhere in the middle, where a man is lifted up outside a city, while the curtain that sealed off the cube tears from the top down. the water rises. God remembers, so you've got something now that changes how a page reads. That these writers built with proportion, that the middle of a Hebrew passage often carries the weight our endings carry. That Leviticus and Genesis chapter 1 and the tabernacle are all wearing each other's shape, and that when the structure gives out in Lamentations chapter 5, the giving out is the prayer. One thing I'd ask you to do with it: pick something short this week, a psalm, a parable, one chapter. Read it out loud the way it was meant to arrive. Then find the middle and ask what's sitting there. You'll be surprised how often it's a line you've been walking past for years. If you want the long version of one piece of this, the next video puts the 7 days of creation next to the 7 speeches of the tabernacle, line by line, and shows why Israel treated a tent as a small universe. It's on screen now.